Some names are worn for the world. Others are kept in the dark, waiting for the one person brave enough to truly see you. This story begins now. The castle had a way of remembering things people preferred to forget. Hermione had noticed it in the weeks since returning. The way certain corridors held a particular quality of silence, heavier than ordinary quiet, as though the stones themselves were still processing what had moved through them the previous year. The tapestries hung with the same authority they always had, but she sometimes caught herself looking at them differently, searching the woven faces of ancient witches and wizards for something she couldn't name. Evidence, perhaps, that survival was not merely biological, that a person could pass through fire and still be recognizably themselves on the other side. She was mostly convinced she was. Mostly. The 8th year common room had been established in a wing of the castle that felt neither entirely Gryffindor nor entirely Slytherin. A diplomatic neutrality that Professor McGonagall had clearly engineered with the precision of a woman who understood that symbolic gestures required architectural support. The sofas were burgundy. The wall sconces burned a cool silver blue. The bookshelves held volumes from every house library. It was, Hermione thought on the first evening, the physical manifestation of a forced peace, technically functional, visibly uncomfortable. She had claimed the armchair nearest the east window before anyone else arrived. That had been 3 weeks ago, and the armchair remained hers by an unspoken law of consistent occupation, the kind of territorial claim that required no wand and no words. She sat in it now, the Thursday evening light going amber and then grey outside the glass, a volume on advanced arithmancy open across her knees, though she hadn't turned a page in 40 minutes. She was thinking about the notice on the board. Mandatory Inter-House Academic Partnership Program. Post-War Reconciliation Initiative. Pairings effective Monday. Attendance non-negotiable. Professor McGonagall. The pairings had been posted that morning. Hermione had read hers 3 times, standing in front of the board with her bag strap cutting into her shoulder, waiting for the letters to rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. They had not. Granger, H. Malfoy, D. She heard him before she saw him. The particular cadence of his footsteps, which she had catalogued without meaning to over the past weeks. A sound like deliberate restraint, each step placed with the care of someone accustomed to being watched. He came through the common room door without looking at anyone, crossed to the far bookshelf, and pulled a volume from the second shelf without reading the spine. He already knew where it was. He had been here 3 weeks, same as she had, and apparently he had also been mapping the room, cataloguing its contents, establishing his own quiet coordinates. She watched him from the armchair with the particular quality of attention she usually reserved for problems she hadn't yet solved. He looked, and she catalogued this observation with the same impersonal precision. Diminished. Not in height, not in the sharp architecture of his features, but in something less measurable. The 6th year version of Draco Malfoy had occupied space aggressively, as though daring the air around him to object. This version moved as though he were trying to take up as little of it as possible. His school robes were immaculate. His expression was the careful, maintained blankness of someone who had learned that faces were liabilities. He hadn't looked at her. He sat at the table in the far corner, opened his volume, and became, to all visible evidence, completely absorbed. Hermione turned back to her arithmancy text. The symbols blurred pleasantly. She read the same theorem 4 times and retained nothing. Monday arrived with rain. Not the gentle, atmospheric precipitation that made the castle romantic in an abstract sense, but the aggressive, horizontal kind that lashed the windows and found the gaps in old stone and made the corridors smell of wet wool and centuries of accumulated damp. Hermione arrived at the small study room McGonagall had assigned them. 4th floor, east corridor, 3rd door, past the suit of armour missing its left gauntlet. Precisely on time, her hair doing what her hair always did in this weather, which was everything it wanted regardless of her opinions on the matter. Malfoy was already there. This startled her more than she would have liked. She had expected to wait. She had prepared, in the 30 seconds between the corridor and the door, a particular arrangement of composed patience. The expression of someone who was perfectly comfortable and absolutely unbothered, and had not spent any portion of Sunday night considering how, precisely, one conducted a civil working relationship with a person who had spent 6 years making her life measurably worse. He was sitting at the table with a folder open before him, a quill in hand, already making notes. He looked up when she entered. The look lasted approximately 2 seconds and contained nothing she could read. "Granger," he said. "Malfoy," she said. She sat down across from him, placed her bag on the floor with deliberate composure, and extracted her own folder. McGonagall had left research assignments on the table. 2 copies, one clearly already moved to his side. She took hers and read it. The subject was name magic. She read the description twice, her scholar's attention snagging immediately on the material despite herself. Ancient branch of magical theory, largely undocumented in post-medieval sources. Practiced primarily in early British and Eastern European wizarding communities. Predicated on the principle that a person's truest self is encoded in sound, specifically the vibrational quality of a name spoken with genuine knowledge of the named individual. True name. Magic, distinct from ordinary naming, requires intimate understanding of the subject to activate. Effects ranging from compulsion to revelation to... "It's not in any of the standard texts," he said, without looking up from his notes. She bristled at this, at the particular implication that he might have already gotten further than she had, which was irrational, given that he'd had perhaps 4 additional minutes with the material. "I'm aware of that," she said. "I'm not criticizing your reading speed, Granger. I'm noting a research constraint." He turned a page. "The Hogwarts library has 3 relevant volumes, and they're all restricted. I've already requested access." She looked up from her folder. He was still writing, quill moving in small, precise strokes across the parchment. His handwriting, she noticed with the peripheral attention that collected such details against her will, was nothing like she'd expected. Not the aggressive slash of someone performing authority. Careful, almost architectural. "You requested library access before the first session," she said. "I came here to pass my NEWTS." He said it simply, with no particular heat. Methodology seemed relevant. She found she had nothing immediate to say to this, which was an unusual position. She looked back at her own folder. The assignment parameters were clear. 8 weeks, collaborative research paper, presentation to the 8th year cohort. The subject had obviously been chosen deliberately. Name magic required 2 researchers because its central premises couldn't be examined in isolation. You needed a named and a namer. You needed relationship. McGonagall, Hermione thought, had a very particular sense of humour. "Fine," she said. "I'll request access to the Eastern European sources separately. The Hogwarts collection will have gaps. This magic has roots outside Britain." "I know." He turned another page. "I already noted that." The rain intensified against the window. The single candle on the table between them guttered in a draught from somewhere and threw his shadow long across the stone wall, wavering. "We should establish ground rules," she said. He finally looked at her properly. The grey of his eyes in the candlelight was not the cold colour she had catalogued from years of confrontation, or perhaps it was the same colour and only the light had changed. "Ground rules," he repeated, "for working together. We're going to be in this room for 8 weeks and the research requires a degree of..." She paused, selecting the word carefully. "Cooperation. I think we should be clear about expectations." Something moved in his expression, very briefly, like a word he'd decided not to say. "All right," he said. "I won't bring up the past if you don't. We're here to do research. Whatever we were to each other before, whatever happened, it's not relevant to the work." The candlelight, his face in it, the silence that stretched exactly 2 beats too long. "Agreed," he said. "And I won't make assumptions about you if you extend me the same consideration." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain made its argument against the glass. When he spoke, his voice had shifted by some fraction she couldn't quantify. Not warmer exactly, but less armoured. "That's a more generous offer than I deserve." She had prepared responses for aggression, for contempt, for the performative indifference he deployed like a weapon throughout their school years. She had not prepared for this. The simple, flat acknowledgement of his own ledger, stated without drama, without the baroque self-flagellation it might have been. Just a fact, offered plainly, taken back immediately behind his neutral expression. "Maybe," she said, "but it's the one I'm making." He looked at her for a moment, and she had the strange, destabilizing sensation of being seen, not assessed, not catalogued as a category, but briefly encountered as a specific person. It lasted no longer than a breath. Then he looked back at his notes. "The vibrational theory of true names has a parallel in Muggle linguistics," he said, as though the previous moment hadn't happened. "Specifically in the study of how children acquire language. I found a reference in a 1923 paper by a Muggle academic named Sapir. McGonagall included it in the supplementary materials." Hermione blinked. "You read the Muggle supplementary materials." "I read everything in the folder." A pause, the fraction of a beat. "Contrary to some people's assumptions." She could not entirely prevent the small thing that happened at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't a smile. She wasn't going to give him that. Not yet. Not after 3 weeks of deliberate non-existence in the same common room. But it was something adjacent. "The Sapir hypothesis is interesting," she said, pulling the paper from her own folder. "Though his framework is descriptive rather than mechanistic. For name magic to function the way these sources suggest, there needs to be something more than symbolic resonance. There needs to be Transmission. The sound has to carry something. He set down his quill. It was such a small gesture, but it changed the quality of his attention entirely. The shift from documenting to considering, from the performed industry of notes to the stillness of someone actually thinking. She recognized it because she did the same thing herself, had always found it impossible to think deeply while her hands were occupied. Carry what? He asked. Knowledge, she said. True knowledge. Not information about someone, not facts. The kind of knowing that changes how you see everything else. She was aware, as she spoke, that she was in the territory of her own genuine interest now, the ideas running ahead of her caution. The texts describe it as recognition, like, the name is a key, but the key only works if the person speaking it has earned the right to hold it, if they actually know who the named person is, at their root. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't classify, not the cool assessment of their earlier exchange, something quieter. And if someone speaks the true name without that knowledge, he asked, nothing happens. The magic doesn't engage. She looked at the text. Or worse, it distorts. The sources aren't entirely clear on what happens when the name is invoked without genuine understanding. Some suggest it causes pain, not physical, the other kind. He said nothing. His hands were flat on the table, still, and she noticed that his left sleeve was pulled down to his wrist, despite the warmth of the room, the fabric sitting precisely at the base of his thumb. She did not look at that. She looked at the research. We should divide the primary sources, she said, pulling her attention back to the practical, the structured, the manageable. You take the British medieval texts. I'll take the Eastern European tradition. We reconvene Thursday with initial findings. Thursday, he agreed. She began organizing her folder. He picked up his quill again. The candle between them had steadied, the draft apparently resolved, and it burned now with a clean, unwavering flame that split the space between them into equal portions of gold. She was almost at the door when he spoke. Granger. She turned. He was looking at his notes, not at her. His quill was moving again, small and precise. The ground rules, he said. They apply to me as well. Whatever I was. He stopped, started again, differently. I read everything in the folder, he said, as though this were the sentence he'd meant all along. We won't fall behind. She stood in the doorway with the rainy corridor behind her and looked at the back of his bent head, the candlelight finding the pale of his hair, and felt something she had no immediate category for. Not trust, not warmth, nothing so evolved as either of those. The first faint tremor of a question she hadn't known she was going to ask. She left without answering. The questions stayed. The restricted sections smelled of old certainty. That was the only way Hermione could describe it. Not merely old parchment, though there was that. The particular tooth of vellum that had absorbed decades of careful and not so careful hands, but something deeper underneath. The scent of conclusions, of knowledge that had decided it was done being questioned. She had always found it faintly oppressive, the restricted section, despite her genuine love of the library in its ordinary reaches. Here the books felt less like invitations and more like warnings dressed in leather bindings. She had come alone on Tuesday morning before breakfast, when the library held only Madame Pince and the particular cathedral quiet, of a space not yet populated by need. She had her McGonagall-signed access slip and her list of Eastern European sources and the very specific focus of someone who intended to spend exactly 90 minutes here and emerge with something useful. She had not expected to find him already at the back table. He had 2 volumes open before him, and a third balanced against his forearm as he read, his head bent at the angle of someone deep enough in text that the surrounding world had become temporarily theoretical. His bag was on the floor, half open, a spill of parchment visible at the top. A cold cup of tea sat at his elbow. He must have carried it from the kitchens. And the fact of it, the simple domestic fact of a cold forgotten cup, landed somewhere in her chest with a weight disproportionate to its significance. She made a sound with her shoes against the stone floor, not accidentally. He looked up. His expression moved through several things quickly. Surprise, the instinct to conceal surprise, and then a kind of flat resignation that settled over his features like a drawn curtain. "You're here early," he said. "So are you." She came to the table and set her bag down at the opposite end. Enough distance to be a statement, not enough to be theatrical. "I didn't think you'd be in until Thursday." "I found a reference in the Hogwarts Archive Index Tuesday evening. Couldn't leave it." He looked back at the volume in his hands. "There's a primary source here that's not in any of the catalogued collections. A Malfoy family text." She went still. He said it without emphasis, which was somehow more striking than if he'd made it significant. Just a fact in a sentence, the family name laid down like a piece of evidence. "A Malfoy family text," she repeated. "My family had extensive dealings with early British name magic practitioners, apparently." He set the volume on the table, spine up, and she could see the embossed crest on the cover. Not the Malfoy crest she recognized from school crests and newspaper photographs, but something older, a simpler design, a serpent not in the attitude of aggression, but coiled, quiescent, at rest. "I didn't know it was here. It was donated to Hogwarts in 1743 by my—" He paused, and she watched him count generations backward with a slight movement of his jaw. "Great, great, great, great grandmother." Apparently, she was concerned about the knowledge being used. Used how? He looked at her across the table. Coercively. True name magic, in its most advanced form, isn't just revelatory. It's operative. If you speak someone's true name with genuine knowledge of them and sufficient magical intent, he looked back at the text, you can compel them. The word landed in the restricted section quiet with a particular weight. "Compel them to do what?" Hermione asked. "Anything, according to this. The name is the deepest access point to a person's magical core. Speak it correctly, and you have purchase, leverage. The texts are careful about the word they use. They call it claiming." He said the word with a visible distaste, small and controlled. "My ancestor apparently found the implications troubling enough to lock the knowledge away." Hermione sat down. Not because she'd decided to stay. She decided that already, the moment she saw the open volumes. But because the movement gave her a moment to arrange her response. "That's a significant ethical dimension we hadn't accounted for," she said. "McGonagall's assignment framing treats name magic as purely historical, as a curiosity. If there's a coercive application, then it's also a weapon," he said. Yes. We should tell her. Probably. He picked up his quill and made a note in the margin of his own parchment. After we understand it properly. Malfoy. I'm not suggesting we use it, Granger. He said it with the particular tired precisions of someone correcting an assumption they'd expected. I'm suggesting that writing a research paper about a form of magic without understanding its full scope would be academically inadequate. You'd agree with that? She would. She did. The frustration of agreeing with him was a specific and novel sensation. She pulled her own sources toward her and opened the first volume. The Eastern European tradition, as she'd begun mapping it on Sunday, used a different framework from the British, less concerned with coercion and more with what the Slavic magical communities called poznani, a word that translated imperfectly as knowing through love. The idea that a true name could only be discovered through genuine care for another person, that the magic was not neutral, it was, in its essential nature, a magic of intimacy. Listen to this, she said, before she'd made the conscious decision to share it. She read from the text, translating from the Old Church Slavonic as she went. The true name is not given at birth, but earned by another. It is spoken first in the heart of one who loves well and knows fully, and only then does it enter the mouth with power. A name spoken without love has no more force than breath against stone. A name spoken with love and knowledge becomes the oldest key. Silence. She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she was beginning to catalogue, the one that wasn't quite neutral, that had something moving underneath it the way a current moves under ice, visible only in the texture of the surface. So, it requires love, he said, or something close enough to love that the magic can't distinguish the difference. She looked back at the text. The Eastern European tradition is much less concerned with the coercive application. They seem to have understood it primarily as a gift, the highest form of recognition one person could offer another. And the British tradition weaponized it. That seems to be what your ancestor was worried about, yes. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the library's high windows, the morning was grey and persistent, the rain from Monday continuing its argument with the castle. A candle somewhere behind them popped and resettled. It's interesting, he said, that the same mechanism. He was choosing his words carefully. She could see the selection happening in real time. Could be either the deepest act of recognition or the most complete violation, depending on the intent. Most powerful things work that way. He looked at her. You're thinking of something specific. It wasn't a question, which flustered her more than a question would have. She smoothed the edge of her open page unnecessarily. I was thinking wand law, actually. The same wand that heals. No, you weren't, he said. The candlelight and the old certainty smell, and the two of them at opposite ends of a table in the restricted section before the rest of the castle had fully woken, and him saying, no, you weren't, with the calm assurance of someone who had actually been paying attention. She lifted her chin. You don't know what I was thinking. You went somewhere personal. Your face does something specific when you're thinking about something personal and trying not to. He said this with no particular triumph in it, clinical almost. You were thinking about the war. The word between them. The war. 3 letters. Entirely insufficient. We agreed not to bring up the past, she said. I didn't bring it up. I identified where your thoughts went. There's a difference. He looked away first, back to his text, and the small mercy of that, of him not pressing it, was something she didn't entirely know what to do with. I was thinking about it too, for what it's worth. She said nothing. The coercive application, he said, to the page in front of him. It's not theoretical to me. I understand what it means to have someone have purchase over you. To be compelled by something that knows exactly where your access points are. He turned a page. His left hand was on the table, and she could see the tendons along the back of it, the faint evidence of some sustained tension he was holding somewhere in his body with the consistency of a habit. Understanding the mechanism doesn't mean I want to use it. It means I want to understand how it works, because I've been on the receiving end of versions of it. The room was very quiet. She thought about all the responses available to her, the sympathetic, the careful, the deflecting, and chose instead the one that felt most honest. I know, she said. He looked up. I don't mean I know what it was like. I can't know that. She held his gaze, which required a specific, conscious effort she didn't examine too closely. I mean, I know that you were, and I know it wasn't. I know it wasn't what you chose. Something happened in his face. She watched it happen and couldn't name it. Not relief, nothing so simple, but some structural thing, as though a weight had shifted from one side of a beam to another, the visible evidence of redistribution. He looked back at his text. We should cross-reference the coercion mechanism with the Eastern European gift framework, he said, in the voice of someone who had closed a door and wished to discuss the room they were now in. If the same magical process underlies both applications, the ethical framework has to account for intent in a way that's nuanced. Agreed, she said. She opened her second volume. The morning light advanced by a fraction through the high windows, and the cold cup of tea at his elbow caught it and held it briefly, the pale ceramic going momentarily warm. They worked in silence for an hour. Not the silence of the first session, not the careful, maintained quiet of two people performing the absence of hostility. This was something different, a working silence, the kind that had texture and purpose, broken occasionally by the scratch of quills or the soft percussion of a turned page, or once by him pushing a specific passage toward her across the table without comment, his finger marking the relevant line, and her reading it and making a note and pushing it back. A small, functional exchange, entirely ordinary. She found herself somewhere around the 40-minute mark, no longer tracking his movements from the edge of her attention. He had ceased to require monitoring and become, instead, simply present. A part of the working atmosphere, like the candlelight and the old certainty smell and the rain at the windows. This was, she recognized, either a very minor development or a significant one. She couldn't tell which yet. It was in the 55th minute that she found the passage. It was buried in the third Eastern European volume, in a chapter on the etymology of magical nomenclature, the kind of dense, scholarly prose that required a specific quality of sustained attention, and she had been giving it exactly that, her pencil moving steadily through the footnotes when the paragraph stopped her. It is recorded among the practitioners of the Carpathian tradition that a child may be given two names at birth: the public name, which is offered to the world and carries the ordinary weight of identity, and the hidden name, which is whispered by a parent in the first hour of life and meant for the child's truest self alone. This hidden name is not written in any registry. It lives only in the mouth of the one who spoke it, and, later, in the heart of the child who carries it. Should another person ever come to know this hidden name, through love, through genuine knowing, the old texts hold that such knowledge constitutes the most complete form of recognition one's soul can offer another. The named becomes, in the deepest magical sense, fully seen. She read it twice, then a third time. She thought about the research parameters. She thought about the assignment. She thought, with the specific, uncomfortable precision of a mind that catalogued things against its will, about the Malfoy family text and what he had said about it. My family had extensive dealings with early British name magic practitioners, and about the way he had said his ancestor's name like a weight, and about the left sleeve pulled to the wrist in a warm room, and about the look on his face when she'd said, "I know it wasn't what you chose," and about the particular, specific quality of the silence between them in the last hour, which had felt less like the absence of conflict and more like the first tentative architecture of something else. She looked up. He was writing, head bent, entirely absorbed. The quill moved in its careful architectural strokes. His cold tea was still at his elbow. She did not say what she was thinking. She wrote a careful, neutral note in the margin of her text. Hidden name tradition, Carpathian, cross-ref with British primary source, Malfoy donation 1743, and closed the page over it. But the passage stayed with her, vivid and precise, all the way through breakfast and her morning classes and the long afternoon, the words arriving back to her in the spaces between other thoughts. The named becomes, in the deepest magical sense, fully seen. She sat through History of Magic and thought about what it would mean to be fully seen. She thought about who, in all the castle, she would least have expected to be the one to make her wonder. Thursday came in cold and clear. The rain had exhausted itself sometime Wednesday night, leaving the castle in the particular crystalline state that followed prolonged wet. Every stone surface sharpened, every window throwing light at unexpected angles, the corridors smelling of washed granite and something almost alpine, a cleanness that felt provisional, as though the weather was simply gathering itself for another attempt. Hermione arrived at the study room exactly on time and found it empty. This was new. She stood in the doorway for a moment, registering the absence with more attention than it warranted, then came in and lit the candle on the table with a murmured word, and arranged her notes with the methodical care she applied to things when her mind was occupied elsewhere. She had spent the past 2 days thinking about the hidden name passage with a persistence that irritated her. It was research. It was relevant to the assignment. The fact that it had lodged itself somewhere more personal than her notes was a function of the subject matter, not of anything else. And she had told herself this with sufficient frequency that she had almost stopped needing to. Almost. He came in 4 minutes later, which she knew because she had not been watching the door, and had therefore counted the seconds with the involuntary precision of someone trying very hard not to. He was slightly out of breath. Not visibly. His expression was its customary composed arrangement. But she had developed, against her better judgment, a sensitivity to the subtler register of his physical states. And there was something in the set of his shoulders, a fraction elevated, and in the way he placed his bag on the table with marginally less control than usual, that suggested he had been moving quickly. "Sorry," he said. She looked up from her notes. The word sat strangely in the room, not because it was insincere, she didn't think it was, but because it was so unadorned. No qualifier, no deflection, just the plain architecture of an apology. "McGonagall stopped me in the corridor," he said, pulling out his chair. "About the research scope. She wants to discuss the coercive application findings. She wants to make sure we're not going to do something inadvisable with them." The corner of his mouth moved. Her exact word was inadvisable, delivered with a specific intonation that meant something considerably stronger. Hermione felt something ease in her chest, the small, involuntary relaxation of shared context. Two people who had been educated by the same formidable woman for 7 years and carried identical fluency in her registers. "What did you tell her?" "That we were treating the material as historical record and ethical case study. That the research paper would include a section on the implications for magical regulation." He sat down and opened his folder. She seemed satisfied, also slightly suspicious. She's always slightly suspicious. "Of me specifically, or of everyone, I think. It's a constitutional trait." Hermione looked at her notes. "Though possibly more pronounced with you at the moment." He was quiet for a beat. "Yes," he said simply. "Probably." She hadn't meant it as a wound, and from his tone he hadn't taken it as one. Just another plain acknowledgement, filed and moved past. She was building a small, careful collection of these moments, the places where she'd braced for defensiveness and found instead this flat, unembellished honesty. It was more disarming than anything else he could have deployed. "I found something in the Eastern European sources," she said. "I want to run it past you before I incorporate it into the paper." She had decided, somewhere in the long thinking of the past 2 days, that she would tell him about the hidden name passage in the context of the research. The academic context. Because it was relevant, and because concealing relevant findings from her research partner would be dishonest, and because she had stopped examining the because beyond that point. She pushed the relevant page toward him. He read it. She watched his face the way she'd watched him read the Sapper paper, with the specific attention of someone observing the movement of thought across a landscape they were beginning to know. His eyes moved steadily through the passage. His expression remained level, and then, in the final lines, something changed, so small she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching with this particular quality of attention. A stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. The stillness of recognition, of something landing. He finished reading and did not immediately speak. "It's relevant to the structural framework," she said, filling the silence with the academic, because the alternative was filling it with something she hadn't prepared language for. If the true name exists in 2 forms, the public name and the hidden name, then the coercive application and the gift application are operating on different targets. Coercion works on the public name, probably. the version a person shows the world, but genuine recognition, the gift that requires access to the hidden name, which means it requires intimacy, he said, the word in his voice in the candlelit room. I was going to say genuine knowledge, she said. Same thing. He pushed the page back toward her. His face had reassembled into its careful arrangement, but there was something around his eyes that hadn't quite been there before. A faint tension, a guardedness that was different in quality from his usual guardedness. Less habitual, more deliberate. The Carpathian tradition has parallels in the early Malfoy text. The family text distinguishes between what it calls the given name and the true name using almost identical language. He opened his own folder and found the relevant passage. Here, the name written in the registry is the name for the world's use. The name first breathed is the name for the soul's keeping. She read it, then read it again. The name first breathed. First breathed, she said, as in, spoken in the first moments of life. By the parent. His voice was carefully neutral. Before the world has access to the child, before it becomes public property. She looked at him. He was looking at the text. The Malfoy family practiced this, she said. It was not quite a question, a pause that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. It's in the family tradition, yes. Whether any specific member... He stopped. His quill was in his hand, and he was not writing with it, just holding it, the small silver ring on his right hand catching the candlelight. It's academically relevant that the tradition was practiced and documented. The specific personal details aren't material to the research paper. She understood, with the particular clarity that came from paying close attention to language, to what was said precisely and what was very carefully not said, that he had just told her something without telling her. The specific personal details. Not, I don't know, but I won't say. The distinction was significant. She did not push it. Agreed, she said. The family documentation establishes British continuity for the tradition. That's the relevant point for the paper. He looked at her then, briefly, with the expression she still didn't have a category for. The current under ice. It lasted 1 second, and then he nodded and looked back at his notes. Good. Shall we draft the structural outline today? We have enough primary material to establish the theoretical framework. Yes. You want to start with the etymology? Historical context first, then etymology, then the dual name structure, then applications, gift and coercive, then the ethical framework. That works. She pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward her. I'll draft, you critique. Or we alternate sections. Alternate sections, she agreed. And they worked. The afternoon light moved across the stone floor in its slow, methodical arc, and the candle between them burned steadily without drama. And the silence that inhabited the room was the working kind again. Purposeful, inhabited, occasionally broken by the exchange of passages, or the low friction of a disagreement about structure that resolved itself within 2 exchanges, because they were, she was finding, more aligned in their intellectual instincts than either of them had any reason to be. It was in the 3rd hour that it happened. She had been reaching for the Eastern European volume at the same moment he had reached across the table for his own tea. Cold again, she noted. He had a gift for forgetting beverages. and their hands had crossed in the space above the middle of the table. Not contact. The near miss of contact, the interference of trajectories that adjusted at the last moment, her fingers pulling back and his arm redirecting. But the proximity had been close enough that she felt the warmth of his hand in the air above hers, the small thermal fact of another person. She took the volume. He took the tea. Neither of them acknowledged it. But something had changed in the atmospheric pressure of the room. A fractional shift, like the moment before weather declares itself. She kept her eyes on the text. Her handwriting on the draft outline continued even and controlled. Underneath her ribs, something she declined to name was moving with the unhurried persistence of a tide. 20 minutes later, she looked up to find him watching her. Not the 2-second assessment of their first session. Not the brief, sharp glance of someone checking a point of reference. He was simply watching her with an expression that had dropped some of its maintenance, some of the careful arrangement that he wore the way she wore her robes, as a matter of daily, unexamined habit. His grey eyes in the afternoon light, which was going amber now, long and level. She held his gaze for a moment. He didn't look away. Neither did she. The candle between them threw 2 shadows on the wall, separate, and then, at the edges, overlapping. "You're doing the thing," she said, because the silence had reached a density that required puncturing, and she had learned that the direct approach was less dangerous than letting things accumulate. "What thing?" "Where you observe something and don't say it." His mouth did the almost movement. "You do the same thing." "I know. I'm pointing it out because we're supposed to be working." "We are working." He looked down at his notes, but not quickly enough to entirely conceal the thing that had been in his expression, something between amusement and something warmer, briefer, more complicated. "I was thinking about the section on intent, whether the paper should take a position or remain descriptive." She knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent 3 weeks developing an involuntary fluency in his deflections, that this was not what he had been thinking about. She also knew that she was not going to say so. "Descriptive," she said. "We're not equipped to adjudicate magical ethics at NEWT level. We present the material and note the implications. McGonagall will push us for a position. Then we develop one together before the presentation, but in the paper, descriptive." "Agreed." He made a note. She looked back at her draft. The light was amber and his shadow was long, and the candle was a steady, unremarkable gold, and she was acutely, inconveniently aware of every small sound in the room. The scratch of his quill, the faint rhythm of his breathing, the occasional ghost of movement when he shifted in his chair. She was aware, specifically, of the moment when he set down his quill again. "Granger." She looked up. He was looking at the table rather than at her, his hands flat on either side of his parchment. The silver ring caught the amber light. His jaw was doing the thing she'd catalogued, the faint tension of words being selected and discarded. "The outline is good," he said, which was not, she was almost certain, what he had started to say. "Thank you," she said, watching him. "You structured the dual name section better than I would have." He picked his quill up again. The Carpathian framework integrates well with the British primary source. It reads as continuous tradition rather than parallel development. "I think it probably was continuous," she said carefully. The geography suggests transmission routes. The Carpathian practitioners were documented as far west as Hermione, her given name, not Granger, not said carelessly, not deployed as a tactical softening. Said the way a person says a word they have been holding in their mouth for some time, testing its weight, uncertain of its landing. The amber light, the candle, the outline on the table between them, and 8 weeks of work still ahead, and the hidden name passage in her notes, and the look on his face when he'd read it, and now her name in his voice, which was doing something to the atmospheric pressure of the room that she was not prepared to catalogue. "The draft is good," he said for the second time, and she understood from the slight roughness at the edge of his voice that he had pulled back from whatever he'd been moving toward, retreated to the safe ground of the academic, the practical, the manageable. She understood it because she had done it first, 20 minutes ago, when she'd said we're supposed to be working. "Thank you," she said again, gently this time. He nodded. He looked at his notes. The candle burned between them with its steady, unremarkable flame. She gathered her things at the end of the session with hands that were perfectly steady. She said, "Thursday," and he said, "Thursday." And she walked out into the corridor which smelled of washed stone and that provisional alpine cleanness. She made it around the corner before she stopped walking. He had said her name, not Granger, her name, and she had felt it in the specific place below the sternum where she had been trying very hard not to feel anything at all. She stood in the corridor for 10 seconds, looking at the cold stone wall. Then she straightened her bag strap and walked to dinner. The paper was going well. This was the problem. Hermione sat in the 8th year common room on Sunday evening, her draft outline spread across the low table before her, and regarded the neat columns of her own handwriting with the specific unease of someone who has received good news and cannot stop waiting for its reversal. 3 weeks into the partnership, and they had more primary material than the assignment required. A structural framework that McGonagall would find rigorous, and a working dynamic that had ceased, somewhere between the restricted section and the amber Thursday afternoon, to feel like something she needed to actively manage. That was the problem. She had been managing it. The careful distances, the academic framing, the deliberate redirection every time the conversation drifted towards something warmer and less structured. She had been managing it with the competence she applied to most things, and it had been working. And then, somewhere in the space of 3 sessions, she had stopped managing and started simply being there, in the room, with him. She pressed her pen against a blank margin and did not write anything. Across the common room, near the silver-blue sconces, Ginny was playing Exploding Snap with Luna and laughing at something with the full-bodied ease of someone who had processed the previous year and come out the other side of it into genuine lightness. Hermione watched her for a moment with something that was not quite envy and not quite longing, but occupied the same approximate geography. She looked back at her notes. The hidden name passage was still there in its careful margin notation. She had not incorporated it into the main draft yet. She had told herself this was because she hadn't completed her cross-referencing, which was technically true. She had not told herself the other reason, which was that writing it formally into the research felt like a commitment to something she hadn't fully named. The irony of that particular avoidance, given the subject of the paper, was not lost on her. Monday's session was different from the beginning. She noticed it the moment she came through the door, the quality of his stillness, which had its own vocabulary by now, specific enough that she could distinguish between the stillness of concentration and the stillness of something held. This was the latter. He was at the table with the Malfoy family text open before him, but he was not reading it. His eyes were on the page, and his hands were flat on the table, and he was somewhere else entirely. He came back when she sat down. The return was visible, a small, deliberate reassembly. "I found something," he said, without preamble. She set down her bag. "In the family text. In a letter, tucked into the back binding." He pushed the text toward her, open to the back cover, where a folded piece of paper, not parchment, actual paper, the Muggle kind, sat in the crease. "I don't think it was meant to be found. It's been there a long time." She looked at it without touching it. The paper was yellowed and the fold lines were soft with age. A letter, folded small, hidden in the spine of a book donated to Hogwarts in 1743. "Have you read it?" she asked. A pause. "Yes." "Is it relevant to the research?" Another pause, this one longer with a different quality. "It's relevant to understanding the tradition's personal application." He was choosing his words with the visible care she'd catalogued, the selection process happening in the slight tightening around his eyes. "It's a letter from the woman who donated the text, to her son, written after the donation, so he never received it." Hermione looked at the letter and then at him. Draco. His name. She had not used it before, had maintained Malfoy with the consistency of someone who understood that names were, as it turned out, not neutral instruments. And she watched it land on him, watched the small involuntary thing it did to his expression. "You should read it," he said, instead of responding to his own name. She unfolded the letter with the careful hands she used for fragile things. The handwriting was old-fashioned, the ink faded to brown, but legible, someone with a scholar's hand, precise and deliberate. She read it slowly. "My dear boy, I write this after returning from Hogwarts, where I have placed the family text in the keeping of the school. I do this because the knowledge it contains is too dangerous for any one family to hold, and because I have seen in your father's use of it what such knowledge becomes when it is held for power rather than given in love. You will not understand this yet. You are 4 years old, and you have your father's eyes and your grandmother's mouth, and you are entirely yourself, in a way that I hope the world will be kind enough to preserve. I have given you 2 names, as the tradition holds. The name in the registry is the name for your life in the world. The name I breathed over you in the first hour, that one belongs to you alone, and to whoever you one day trust enough to know it. I will not write it here. Some things must be spoken, or they are nothing. I want you to know this. The true name I gave you is not the name of what our family wants you to become. It is the name of what I saw when I looked at you before the world had told you what to be. Keep it. Even if you forget it, it will keep itself. Your mother Hermione set the letter down. The common room sounds from 3 floors away. The candle, the Malfoy family text with its coiled, quiescent serpent on the cover. She did not look at him immediately. She took 3 seconds to look at the letter, at the brown ink and the old paper and the words before the world had told you what to be, and felt something move through her chest with the slow force of something geological. When she looked up, he was watching the table. "She wrote it in 1743, he said, in the voice of someone providing academic context, which was not at all what he was doing. The date on the letter, which means the child she wrote it to, was your ancestor, she said. Not you, not me." He looked up, but the tradition continued. "It's documented in the family records through each generation. The two names, the hidden name breathed in the first hour." He stopped. His hands were flat on the table. "My mother continued the tradition." She held very still. "I'm not telling you what it is," he said, immediately, the words arriving with a speed that suggested they'd been prepared. "I want to be clear about that. It's private. It's not research data. It's—" He stopped again. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking." The relief that moved through him was visible only in the slight lowering of his shoulders, a millimeter of released tension. "I thought you should know the tradition is lived, not just historical, for the paper's contextual frame. The personal applications section will be stronger if—" "Draco." She said his name again, deliberately this time, and watched it do the same thing it had done the first time. That small, involuntary response, like a word recognized in an unexpected language. "You don't have to justify telling me something personal by making it academic." His jaw did the selection and discard movement. "I know that," he said. And then, quieter, "I'm not practiced at the other kind." The other kind, the non-academic, the personal offered without the frame of utility. She thought about what to do with this, with the care of someone handling the letter, something old and fragile and not meant to be found. "Neither am I," she said. Not with people I didn't expect." His eyes on her, grey in the candlelight, the current visible. They worked for an hour after that, and the work was good, fluid and precise in the way that their sessions had become. The exchange of material and ideas running with an efficiency that she privately found remarkable. The two people who had spent 6 years in active hostility could develop in 3 weeks a working rhythm this clean. It was in the second hour that she made the mistake, not intentional. She understood that afterward, with complete clarity. There was no intent in it, no calculation, nothing but the simple, unthinking automaticity of a scholar following a thread. She was writing the personal applications section of the paper, the words coming quickly, and she reached for the specific detail that would make the historical framework concrete, that would give the dry theoretical structure a human face. She wrote, "The tradition's continuation into modern wizarding families is evidenced by documented practice in at least one notable British magical lineage in which the hidden name was reportedly given in the first hour of the child's life and retained as the family's most private inheritance, its existence known only within the immediate family unit. This practice, maintained across multiple generations, suggests that name magic's gift application retained its significance even as the coercive form fell into disuse." She stopped. She looked at what she had written. She looked at it for a long moment with a specific, cold clarity that came when the brain registered, slightly too late, the exact weight and shape of what the hands had done. She had used it. The detail he had given her, Not as research data, he had said. Not as research data. It's private. She had used it anyway. Not consciously, not maliciously. The scholar's habit of material, the reflex of evidence to argument, the way her mind moved directly from here is relevant information to here is where it belongs in the structure without passing through the ethical filter that should have caught it. She had just used his family's private tradition as a footnote. She put down her quill. He was writing at the other end of the table, absorbed, and had not seen what she'd drafted. She looked at his bent head, the pale hair, the careful architectural handwriting moving across his parchment, and felt the cold spread through her chest with the methodical unhurry of something that knew it had all the time it needed. She could remove it. She would remove it. She was already drawing a line through the paragraph, her hand moving before she'd consciously decided, the strokes firm and complete. Gone. As though she hadn't written it. But she had written it. The thought had moved directly from his trust to her argument without resistance, and no amount of crossing out changed the neural path that had opened and closed in the space of 60 seconds. She sat with the crossed-out paragraph and the cold in her chest and the sound of his quill moving steadily at the other end of the table. She did not tell him. This was the second mistake, though she didn't know it yet. The instinct to correct the error invisibly, to absorb the guilt privately, and present him with a clean draft and her own resolved conscience and no interruption to the working rhythm they had built. She told herself it was because she'd already fixed it. The paragraph was gone. No harm had reached him. She told herself this with sufficient conviction that she almost believed it. She gathered her things at the end of the session with the ordinary movements of an ordinary ending. He said Thursday. She said Thursday. They walked out into the corridor and turned in opposite directions. In her room that night, she sat on her bed and looked at her draft with the crossed-out paragraph, the lines through it dark and definitive, and understood that crossed out was not the same as not written. She had taken something he'd offered without a frame and immediately put a frame around it. She had made it useful. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and sat in the dark behind them and felt the cold settle into something more permanent, something that had the specific weight of an error that has been made and cannot be time-turned. It's private, he had said. It's not research data. She had heard it. She had agreed. And then her scholar's mind had moved like water finding the lowest path. And she had used it anyway. And the fact that she'd caught herself and crossed it out did not change what the reflex had revealed. That some part of her still processed him as material, as source, as evidence to be shaped into argument. She was not sure, lying in the dark of Tuesday morning, which frightened her more, that she had done it, or that it had taken her this long to understand why it mattered. She told him on Thursday. She had decided this on Tuesday night, somewhere in the long architecture of sleeplessness, and had spent Wednesday reinforcing the decision with the methodical stubbornness she applied to things she knew were right and didn't want to do. She would tell him. She would tell him exactly what had happened, the paragraph, the reflex, the crossing out, and she would not soften it with context or cushion it with qualification, because he deserved the plain version, the one without her careful editorial management of how she appeared in it. She arrived at the study room early. She sat down. She arranged her notes with hands that were steady and a chest that was not. He came in precisely on time, which she had learned was his version of early. The deliberate punctuality of someone who considered lateness a form of disrespect. He set his bag down, pulled out his chair, and looked at her face. He stopped. Not dramatically, just stopped, in the small way of someone whose body has registered information before their mind has processed it. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. The flat indicative of someone who had learned to read rooms the way others read texts. "I need to tell you something," she said. "About the draft." She told him. The paragraph, word for word, as best she could reconstruct it. The reflex, the crossed-out lines. All of it in the plain version she had promised herself, without the softening she'd spent 2 days resisting the urge to apply. When she finished, the room was very quiet. He was sitting across from her with his hands in his lap. She couldn't see them, which was its own kind of information. The withdrawal of the visible tells she'd learned to read. And his expression had gone to the careful blankness. Not the maintained blankness of their early sessions, which had been a performance of indifference. This was something older, the face of someone who has just confirmed a thing they had almost stopped expecting. "You crossed it out," he said. "Yes, immediately. It won't appear in any draft." "But you wrote it." "Yes." The single syllable sat between them. She did not add to it. She had decided not to add to it, not to explain the scholar's reflex, not to contextualize the automaticity of it, because all of those things were true and none of them were the point. He looked at the table. The candle between them burned with its steady flame, indifferent. "I told you it wasn't research data," he said. "I know. I was specific about that. I know." Something moved in his jaw. The selection and discard, but slower this time, heavier, like the mechanism had more material to sort through than usual. When he spoke, his voice was level in the way that required effort to maintain. She could hear the effort, faint and structural, the way you could hear the load-bearing work of a wall by pressing your hand against it. "And you still..." "It was a reflex," she said, and then stopped herself. "No, I'm not doing that. It doesn't matter that it was a reflex. The reflex is the problem, that my first instinct was to use it." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. "I'm sorry." The word in the room. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the candle flame moved in some unfelt draft and steadied again. Long enough that she heard, distantly, the hollow echo of footsteps somewhere in the corridor outside, passing and fading. "You said," he began and stopped, started differently. "You said at the beginning that you wouldn't make assumptions about me." "Yes." "That was the ground rule. No assumptions." "Yes." "Writing that paragraph." He stopped again. His hands came back to the table, flat, and she could see the tendons in his left hand, the quiet evidence of sustained tension. "It assumed I was material, that what I told you was evidence, something to be shaped into an argument." "I know." She kept her voice even with the same effort she could hear in his. "And I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know what happened." He looked at her then. The grey eyes unguarded in a way that was almost worse than the blankness. She could see the specific quality of the hurt in them. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just the flat recognition of someone who had taken a careful risk and watched it demonstrate in real time, exactly why careful risks were dangerous. "You're the first person," he said, "in this building who treated me as if I might be something other than what I was." A pause. I thought that meant something. The candlelight and the hollow corridor and the table between them and the weight of what he just offered her. Offered plainly, without deflection, without the academic frame, the other kind he'd said he wasn't practiced at. And she felt the cold in her chest do something complicated, contracting and expanding at once, the specific ache of receiving something you've damaged your right to. "It does mean something," she said. "Apparently not enough to... It means everything." Her voice came out with more force than she'd intended, and she saw it register in him, the slight change in his stillness. "That's why I'm telling you. Because it matters. Because you matter. Not as research, not as material. And I violated that, even for a moment, even crossed out, and you deserve to know." The room held them in its Thursday afternoon light, which was different from Tuesday's amber, cooler, more direct, the crystalline quality of the post-rain air persisting into the week. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away. "I need to think," he said. "All right. About whether..." He stopped. "I need to think." "All right," she said again. He gathered his things with the composed efficiency of someone performing normalcy with great concentration. His folder, his quill, the Malfoy family text, which he picked up last and held for a moment before placing it carefully in his bag. He stood. "Malfoy," she said, because she couldn't let him reach the door without it. He paused, didn't turn. "I know it doesn't fix it," she said. "I know sorry isn't. I know it's not sufficient. But I need you to know that I see what I did. Not a sanitized version of it. The actual thing." A long pause. The door was 3 steps from him. She counted them without meaning to. "I know," he said quietly, and left. The following week had a specific texture. She had experienced silences before. The post-argument silences of her friendship with Ron, which were loud and combustible and resolved themselves in proportion to stubbornness. The silences of the war, which were a different category entirely, operational and terrifying. This silence was neither. It was the silence of someone who was still present. She saw him in the common room, in the corridors, at the Slytherin-adjacent end of the breakfast table, but had withdrawn the particular quality of attention she hadn't realized she'd been receiving until it was absent. He looked through her, not with hostility. That would have been easier. With the carefully managed neutrality of someone who had closed a specific door and was waiting, with great composure, to decide whether to open it again. She did not attempt to open it for him. She had caused the closing. The reopening was his. She went to the library alone. She worked on her sections of the paper with the focused industry of someone who needed her hands occupied. She sat in the east window armchair in the evenings and read things she didn't retain, and looked at the silver-blue sconces and thought about the letter in the family text, before the world had told you what to be, and about the look on his face when he'd said, "I thought that meant something," and about the way her own reflex had moved like water, finding the lowest path. And she held all of this with the discomfort of not resolving it, because some things needed to be held in discomfort long enough to be properly understood. She understood several things in that week of crystalline silence. She understood that the reflex had not come from indifference. It had come from the opposite, from the way her mind had been for weeks, building structures around him, incorporating him into her thinking so thoroughly that the boundary between person I am learning to know and source I am drawing from had blurred in a way she hadn't monitored because she hadn't expected to need to. You monitored the boundaries you expected to be tested. She had not expected him. She understood that this was not an excuse. It was an explanation of mechanism, which was a different thing. And she was old enough now, post-war and post-everything, to know the difference. She understood, sitting in the east window armchair on the fourth evening of the silence, watching the fire in the grate and not reading the book in her lap, that she missed him. Not the research partnership, though she missed that too, its unexpected efficiency, and the specific pleasure of thinking alongside someone whose mind moved with a different but compatible architecture. She missed him. The almost movement at the corner of his mouth, the flat, unembellished honesty that appeared in the spaces where she'd expected deflection, the sound of his name in her own voice, which had started to feel like something she'd been saying for longer than 3 weeks. This understanding arrived without fanfare, in the firelight of an ordinary Sunday, and she sat with it in the same way she'd been sitting with the discomfort, without resolving it, without reaching for the academic frame, just holding it, plainly. On Monday, she found a note on the study room door, not a letter, a single sentence on a piece of Hogwarts notepaper, folded once. Her name on the outside in the architectural handwriting she would have known without the name. The paper still needs finishing. Thursday, if you're willing. DM. She stood in the corridor outside the room with the note in her hand, and the hollow echo of her own footsteps still settling in the stone around her. The suit of armor missing its left gauntlet stood at the end of the corridor in its permanent, patient incompleteness. She read the note twice. If you're willing. Not as scheduled or as assigned. Not the language of obligation. The language of choice. His choice, offered to her choice. The mutual voluntariness of two people deciding to continue something that had hurt them both in different ways and at different times, and still, apparently, mattered. She folded the note and put it in her robe pocket. She thought about the hidden name passage, which she had still not incorporated into the draft. The name becomes, in the deepest magical sense, fully seen. She thought about what it meant to see someone. Not the information about them, not the evidence, not the research data, but the actual person, the one that existed before the world had told them what to be. She thought about a 4-year-old boy, and a letter that was never delivered, and a name breathed in the first hour that had been kept across the decades in the mouth of one person and the heart of another. She thought about the word willing. She took out her quill, turned the note over, and wrote a single word beneath his. Yes. She slid it under the study room door. She walked back toward the common room through the crystalline Monday corridor, and the suit of armor stood in its patient incompleteness behind her. And somewhere in the castle the bells marked the hour with the same indifferent authority they had marked every hour for 1,000 years. And she walked through the sound of them with her hands steady, and her chest doing something that was not quite resolution and not quite anticipation, but occupied, once again, that same approximate geography as both. Thursday arrived the way important things sometimes did. Quietly, without announcement, wearing the ordinary clothes of an ordinary day. Hermione dressed with the same care she always took, and then stood in front of her mirror for 30 seconds longer than usual, which she acknowledged to herself and declined to examine further. She ate breakfast. She attended charms. She took notes on the theoretical applications of switching spells, with the focused attention of someone whose mind was entirely elsewhere, and who was managing the gap between those two facts with practiced competence. At 2:30, she walked to the 4th floor. The corridor smelled of old stone and the ghost of last week's rain, which had finally given way to something that might, cautiously, be called autumn proper. A dry cold that came in under the doors and made the castle's existing chill feel intentional rather than incidental. The suit of armour at the corridor's end stood in its customary incompleteness. She passed it without looking at it and stopped at the 3rd door. She had her hand on the latch before she registered that she could hear, faintly through the old wood, the sound of movement inside. Something being set on a table, the quiet percussion of a chair. She had not been first, this time either. She opened the door. He had arranged the room differently. She noticed it immediately. Not dramatically differently. Nothing had been moved in any grand gesture. But the 2 candles that were usually kept at opposite ends of the table had both been placed in the centre, close together, so that the working space between them was warmer and more immediate. A 3rd candle, new, stood at the edge. Someone had also opened the room's single window by a precise fraction, enough to let the autumn cold in without the noise of the wind, so that the candle flames moved with a faint, continuous life they hadn't had before. He was standing at the bookshelf when she came in, his back to her, pulling the Malfoy family text from his bag. He turned when he heard the door. They looked at each other across the rearranged room. "You moved the candles," she said. The light was better for reading at the centre. He set the text on the table. His voice was the composed one, maintained, but underneath the maintenance she could hear something that had not been there in their early sessions. Something careful, like a person walking a path they have only recently established and are not yet certain will hold their weight. "It is better," she said. She sat down. He sat down. The 3 candles between them burned with their small, continuous lives, and the autumn cold came in through the window's fraction and made the warmth of the flames feel deliberate and earned. "I read your note," she said. "I assumed, since you're here." "I read it several times." He looked at her. It was 1 sentence. "I know." She arranged her folder without particular purpose. "I read it several times anyway." Something happened at the corner of his mouth, the almost movement which she had not seen in a week, and whose absence she had, she now understood, been cataloguing with the same involuntary precision she'd catalogued everything else about him. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I said yes." "You said yes to the paper. I wasn't sure what else that included." She looked at him steadily. "What did you want it to include?" The question sat in the candlelit room with its autumn cold air, and she watched him take it in and hold it, watched the selection and discard work in his jaw, watched him arrive at something. "I want to keep working with you," he said. "The paper, yes. But also—" He stopped. "I was sitting in the library on Tuesday, and I found a reference that I knew you'd find interesting, and I turned to say something, and you weren't there." He looked at the table. "That was clarifying." The word clarifying, so precise, so carefully chosen to carry the weight he was putting on it without quite saying what the weight was. "I had the same experience," she said. "Differently, but the same." He looked up. "I was in the common room Wednesday evening, and Ginny said something about the wizarding tradition of birth names, and I spent 20 minutes wanting to tell you about it." She held his gaze. "I didn't have to stop myself. I just wanted to tell you, and you weren't there to tell." The candles, the autumn cold, the two of them on opposite sides of a table that felt, this Thursday, considerably less vast than it had on the first one. "About what happened," he began. "You don't have to." "I want to." He said it with a quiet firmness that stopped her. "I've been thinking about it. The paragraph." He was looking at the table, his hands flat. "I was angry. I won't pretend I wasn't." He looked up. "But I've also been thinking about why I told you in the first place." She waited. "I told you because the letter affected me, and I was sitting 3 feet away from you, and the distance between this is research, and this is personal had already been closing for weeks, and I made a decision to speak across it." He stopped. "I made that decision. I can't be angry at you for not having perfect command of a boundary I was actively dissolving." She sat with this for a moment. "That's very generous. It's accurate." He picked up his quill, the habitual gesture of hands needing occupation. "I'm not saying what you did was nothing. It wasn't. But I've been performing grievance as a substitute for thinking, and I'd rather think. Performing grievance as a substitute for thinking." She absorbed the phrase and felt something in her chest move with it. Not admiration exactly, but the specific response she had to clear-eyed honesty, the recognition of someone seeing themselves without the flattering edits. "I do that too," she said. "Not with you, with myself." She looked at her own hands. "I perform certainty as a substitute for asking questions I don't want answered." "What questions?" She looked up. The candles between them threw their double light, and his face in it was open in a way she'd seen only in fragments before. The full version of the expression she'd catalogued in pieces, the current no longer under ice, but moving visibly, present and direct. "Questions about what this is," she said. "What's been happening in this room for the past 5 weeks?" The autumn cold came through the window and moved the candle flames in their small, continuous way. He looked at her with the current visible in his eyes and said nothing for long enough that the nothing itself became an answer. "I know what it is," he said, finally, quietly. "So do I," she said. "I've been substituting certainty for the alternative." "Which is?" "Saying it out loud." She held his gaze. "In a room where it can be heard." He set down the quill, both hands flat on the table. She could see the silver ring, the tendons, the left sleeve at his wrist, and she looked at all of it with the clear attention of someone who has decided to stop managing what she sees. "I don't know how to do this," he said. And then, with a different quality, lower, "I mean that. I don't have the vocabulary for something that isn't a transaction or a performance. Everything I was taught about how people relate to each other was transactional." He paused. "This isn't that." "No," she agreed. It isn't. I don't want it to be. Neither do I. The room held them. The castle held the room. Outside, the autumn afternoon was doing something golden and specific with the light, and it came in through the fractional window opening and joined the candlelight in a collaboration that made the stone walls look almost warm. "Then we learn," she said. "Both of us. We're fairly good at learning things." The corner of his mouth moved. Not the almost movement this time, the actual one, small and real and entirely his. "Fairly good," he said. "Between the two of us, we have approximately 600 books worth of applicable theory, none of which covers this specific situation. No, the literature has significant gaps." His almost smile remained, and she felt the warmth of it in the same specific place below the sternum where she'd felt her name in his voice. Though the name magic research is arguably relevant. "Arguably," she said, and meant more by it than she said, and from the quality of his attention, she understood he heard the more. They worked. The session had a different atmosphere from any preceding it. Not the careful management of their early meetings, not the working intimacy of the middle ones, but something new, something that had been cleared of debris and was now simply open. They spoke about the paper and about things adjacent to the paper, and occasionally about things not adjacent to it at all. And the transitions between those registers happened without friction, without the small, effortful negotiations she'd previously monitored. He told her that the hidden name tradition in the Malfoy family had skipped his grandfather's generation, that there was a gap in the family records, a single generation where the practice was absent, and that it had been his mother who had reinstated it. He said this to the page in front of him, not to her, but the offering was unmistakable. She told him that she had thought about the Carpathian passage every day since she'd first read it. She said this to her own notes, mirroring his angle, giving him the same permission she gave herself, to speak toward the general direction of another person and trust that the words would find their way. The named becomes, in the deepest magical sense, fully seen, he said, quoting it from memory. She looked up. He was still looking at his notes. "I've been thinking about whether that's something a person can choose, or whether it just happens." "I think it starts by happening," she said, "and then you choose whether to let it continue." He was quiet for a moment. "And if you've spent most of your life making yourself deliberately opaque, then I think it's harder and more frightening and probably necessary." She looked at the side of his face, the clean angle of his jaw, the way the candlelight found the pale of his hair and made something specific of it. "And I think the people who are most frightened of being seen are sometimes the ones who most need to be." He turned to look at her. The current in his eyes was very close to the surface. "Is that from the research?" he asked. "No," she said. "That's mine." He held her gaze for a moment that was longer and more direct than any preceding it. Not the 2-second assessments of their early sessions, not the current under ice of the middle ones, but a clear and open looking, the kind that required something of both the person doing it and the person receiving it. Then he looked away, back to his notes, and she could see the slight colour that had moved across the back of his neck, high and brief, and she felt something in her chest do something warm and entirely involuntary. At the end of the session, when they were gathering their things, he paused with his bag half packed and said, without looking at her, "The paper needs one more primary source for the gift application section. There's a volume in the restricted section I haven't accessed yet, the 1687 Carpathian Compendium. Would it be useful to go together? Tuesday morning, before breakfast?" The question had too many words in it. She had noticed this about him, that when something mattered, he overconstructed the request, built scaffolding around it, gave it the dimensions of a practical arrangement to make the actual ask less visible. She could see the actual ask. "Tuesday morning," she said. "Yes." He nodded, picked up the Malfoy family text, placed it in his bag with the same care he always used, the care of someone who had learned to handle things that mattered with deliberate attention. At the door, he paused. She was still at the table, her bag over her shoulder, and she looked at him in the doorway with the autumn light behind him and the 3 candles still burning at the table center. And he looked back at her with the open, current visible expression that she was beginning to understand was the face he had when he had stopped performing and was simply entirely present. "Granger," he said. She waited. "Thank you." He said it plainly, without scaffolding. "For telling me about the paragraph." A pause. "Most people don't tell the truth about the small dishonesties. They smooth them over and let you live in the smoothed version." She looked at him for a moment. "I didn't want to smooth it," she said. "Not with you." He held her gaze for one long, clear beat. Then he was gone, his footsteps precise and unhurried in the corridor, and she stood in the study room with its 3 candles burning, and the autumn cold coming through the window's fraction, and something in her chest that had nothing theoretical about it, nothing academic, nothing that could be cross-referenced or cited or shaped into an argument. Just warmth, simple and specific, and entirely irrevocably his. The 1687 Carpathian Compendium smelled of pine resin and something darker beneath it, mineral and ancient, as though it had spent centuries in a stone room very close to the earth. Hermione noticed this the moment she lifted it from the restricted section shelf, the way the scent rose from the binding like a small specific history, the record of every climate the book had passed through before arriving here. She set it on the table between them. Tuesday had arrived with a frost. The first of the season, thin and precise, etching the exterior windowsills in white and making the castle's internal warmth feel newly deliberate, something the building was actively choosing to provide. The restricted section at this hour was entirely theirs. Madame Pince was at her desk in the main library, visible through the iron gate as a distant, composed silhouette, and the early morning quiet had a different quality from the ordinary library. Quiet, deeper and less inhabited, the silence of a space that had not yet been asked to hold anyone's urgency. Draco sat across from her with his own volume already open, a thin manuscript in what she recognized as early modern Czech, his quill making the small architectural notes she could identify now without looking directly at them. She had developed, she understood, a peripheral fluency in him, a capacity to receive information about his state and occupation from the edge of her attention, without the active monitoring she deployed in the early weeks. It had stopped being surveillance. It had become something more like the ordinary awareness of a person you have decided to share space with. He looked up when she placed the compendium on the table. "Pine," he said. "I thought the same thing." She sat down. "And something underneath, stone cold almost. Carpathian mountain stone." He said it as though he knew this from experience rather than inference. And she filed the detail in the collection she kept of small, specific things that told her something real about who he was before he'd been shaped into what she'd known. She opened the compendium to the index. The text was dense, and the language was a Slavic variant she could manage, but not move through quickly, each page requiring the kind of slow, attending translation that meant she read with one part of her mind and thought with another, the thoughts running in the background like a parallel process. The gift application section, the Poznani framework. She found the relevant chapter index and turned to page 247 and began. They worked in the frost-sharpened morning and the pine and stone smell and the distant, composed silhouette of Madame Pince. And the silence between them was the good kind, the inhabited kind, and Hermione read slowly through the Carpathian text and felt the parallel thoughts running underneath. She had slept badly. Not unhappily. There was a distinction, she discovered, between the sleeplessness of distress and the sleeplessness of something that had too much interior weather to lie quietly in the dark. She had lain in her room and looked at the ceiling and thought about Thursday's session with a thoroughness she usually reserved for examination revision, turning it over, examining its angles, finding the thing that kept returning regardless of how many times she set it down. "I know what it is," he had said. She had said she knew too. And she did. She had been honest about that. But knowing and understanding were different things, and what she was working toward in the frost dark of Tuesday morning was the understanding, the full version without the managed edges. She was on page 251 when she found it. Not a reference she'd been looking for. Not a cross-reference to the dual name structure or the gift application mechanism or any of the specific threads their research had been pulling. It was in a footnote of all places, a small, dense footnote at the bottom of a page about the first recorded speaking of a true name, tucked so far into the page's margin that the translator had given it only a cursory rendering. She almost missed it. Her eye snagged on a single word. Malfoy. Not Malfoy. Malfoy. The older form, the French origin, the version that predated the British Anglicization by several centuries. In a 1687 Carpathian compendium. She bent closer to the page, translating as she went, the Slavic working slowly through her mind. Among those who came to study the gift tradition in the winter of 1683 was a practitioner of the Western school, a woman who gave her name as Malfoy and who asked questions of unusual precision about the hidden name's first speaking. She wished to know, specifically, whether the magic required that the hidden name be spoken to the child directly, whether the child's hearing of it was necessary for the transmission. The teachers told her, "It is enough that the name is breathed in the child's presence. The child does not need to understand. The child only needs to receive." She thanked them and did not return, but the questions she asked were recorded because they indicated a practitioner who understood the tradition not as scholarship, but as something she intended to use. Hermione sat back. She read the footnote again. A Malfoy, in the Carpathian Mountains in 1683, 4 years before this compendium was written, asking about the mechanics of the hidden names first speaking, going home with the knowledge, and 60 years later, his ancestor's letter. I have given you 2 names, as the tradition holds. She looked at him across the table. He was reading, absorbed, the quill moving in its small strokes. His left sleeve was at his wrist, as always, the habitual gesture of concealment so thoroughly incorporated that she doubted he was aware of doing it. The silver ring on his right hand caught the library's early light. His face in concentration had a quality she had catalogued in full now. The slight vertical line between his brows, the way his lower lip pressed fractionally inward when a passage required extra effort, the absolute stillness of his body when his mind was fully occupied. She thought about the letter in the family text. The name I breathed over you in the first hour. That one belongs to you alone, and to whoever you one day trust enough to know it. Whoever he one day trusted enough. She thought about what trust meant, specifically to a person who had been taught that every relationship was transactional, who had said in the candlelit study room, I don't have the vocabulary for something that isn't a transaction or a performance, who had given her the letter's existence not because it was research data, but because the distance between this is research and this is personal had been closing, and he had made a decision to speak across it. She thought about what it meant to receive something like that. She thought about the reflex that had moved like water toward the lowest path, and the crossed-out paragraph, and the week of crystalline silence, and the rearranged candles on Thursday, and the actual smile at the corner of his mouth, and the way he had said, I know what it is with the particular quietness of someone saying a thing they have been holding for longer than the conversation. Draco, she said. He looked up. The vertical line between his brows remained for a moment, the residue of the text, and then his expression shifted into the present, into the restricted section and the frost and her face across the table. I found something, she said, in the compendium. She pushed the volume toward him, her finger at the footnote. She watched him read it. She watched the text move through him, the slight change in his stillness first, the structural shift of material landing, and then something else, something that moved slower and deeper, arriving in his expression by degrees. He read it twice. Then he sat back. 1683, he said. 4 years before this was written. 60 years before your ancestor donated the family text. She held his gaze. She went to the source. She learned it directly. And brought it back. And it became the family tradition. She paused. The one your mother continued. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the library's high windows, the frost was beginning to release, the white on the sills thinning to moisture, the morning warming by fractions. The pine and stone smell of the compendium was present between them. There's something else, she said. He waited. I've been thinking about what you said Thursday, about the distance between research and personal. She kept her voice even. I want to be clear about something, about what this is, what I think this is, because I said I knew and I do, but I want to say it in words in this room, not just carry it silently. His hands were flat on the table. The current in his grey eyes was very close to the surface. "I care about you," she said, plain and unscaffolded. "Not as a research partner, not as someone I'm assigned to, as you. The specific person who forgets his tea and reads everything in the folder and rearranges the candles and told me about the letter because the distance was closing and he decided to speak across it." She felt her pulse at the base of her throat, steady and present. "I care about that person." The restricted section held its cathedral quiet around them. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see the selection happening. Not the discard this time, but a different process, slower and more internal, like a person translating something from a language they learned in private and have rarely spoken aloud. "I've been," he began, stopped, started again at a different angle. "You are the only person in my recent memory who has made me feel like the specific person I was before." He stopped again. His jaw worked once. "Before everything. And I don't have the clean version of this. I don't have the vocabulary that sounds like something you'd want to hear. But I think about you constantly. I think about the way your mind moves, and I think about what you'll say to the passage I'm reading. And I think about..." He stopped. "I've been thinking about you since the restricted section. Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago, when you read the Carpathian passage out loud and your voice did the thing it does when you're genuinely engaged with an idea." She felt the warmth move through her chest and did not try to catalogue it. "What thing?" she asked softly. "It goes lower," he said, "by about half a register. You don't notice you're doing it." She looked at him across the compendium and the frostlight and the pine and stone smell, and felt the particular quality of being known. Not all of her, not the whole vast, complicated interior of it, but this specific thing about her voice, observed with a care so precise it had its own texture. "I have something to show you," he said. He reached into his bag and withdrew a piece of parchment. Not research notes. Smaller, folded ones, the kind of parchment you used for personal writing rather than academic work. He held it for a moment without unfolding it. "The paper is nearly finished," he said. "We have the framework, the cross-references, the ethical section. The one thing it's missing is the personal application section, the evidence of lived practice." He looked at the parchment in his hands. I was going to write it in the third person. Documented practice, unnamed source." He paused. "I'm not going to do that." She waited. "My name," he said. "The one in the registry. Draco." He looked up. "It's from the Latin. It means dragon. My grandfather chose it. It's the family's idea of legacy, of lineage, of what a Malfoy should carry forward." He held her gaze. "It doesn't fit. I think it probably never did. My mother, when she used it, she would sometimes pause before saying it. A very small pause. I used to think it was just her manner. I understand now that it was a different kind of pause." Hermione did not move, did not breathe, quite. "She gave me another name," he said. "In the first hour. She breathed it over me, and she never wrote it down, and I have carried it for 22 years without ever speaking it to anyone." He unfolded the parchment. "I wrote it down for the first time last night. I've been sitting with whether..." He stopped. She could see the cost of this in him. Not dramatic, not performed, but the genuine metabolic effort of someone arriving at the edge of their own capacity for vulnerability and choosing to step across it anyway. "You don't have to," she said gently. "The paper doesn't need—" "It's not for the paper." His voice was very quiet. "I want you to know it. That's the reason. The frost light, the pine and stone, the early morning with its cathedral quiet, and the distant composed silhouette of Madame Pince, and the two of them at a table in the restricted section with a folded piece of parchment between them." He slid it across the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up. One word, in the careful architectural handwriting she would have known anywhere, written in the center of the page with the specific weight of something that had been private for 22 years and was now, for the first time, being offered to another pair of eyes. Lucan. She read it once, twice. She felt it settle somewhere deep and specific, felt the magic of the research become suddenly, viscerally real. Not theory, not historical record, but this name on this page, offered by this person across this table. She looked up. He was watching her with the open, current visible expression, every layer of maintenance absent. The specific person he was before the world had told him what to be looking back at her across the compendium and the frost light, waiting with the patience of someone who has spent everything they have on a single, honest gesture, and is now entirely in the hands of what comes next. She set the parchment down carefully. "Lucan," she said aloud. His true name, spoken with the full weight of everything she knew about him, the cold tea and the architectural handwriting and the rearranged candles and the letter he'd shared because the distance was closing, and the almost smile and the flat, unembellished honesty and the specific person she had been thinking about since a Tuesday morning in the restricted section when his voice had said, "No, you weren't." And she had felt, for the first time, genuinely encountered. The name left her mouth, and the air in the restricted section changed. Not dramatically, not with a crack of magic or a flash of light, nothing cinematic. But something shifted, a pressure differential almost, like the moment after a door is opened between two rooms that have been separate for a long time, the atmospheres beginning to find their equilibrium. His eyes, when she met them, were very bright. The name sat between them in the frost light, like something newly born. Hermione felt it, not metaphorically, not as the poetic approximation of an emotion she might later transcribe into academic language, but as a genuine physical phenomenon, a warmth that moved through the air of the restricted section with the slow, deliberate progress of sunlight crossing a stone floor. The candle on the table between them had not moved. The distant silhouette of Madame Pince had not shifted. The pine and stone smell of the compendium was unchanged. And yet the room was entirely different from the room it had been 30 seconds ago, as though the speaking of one true word had adjusted the calibration of everything it touched. She watched his face. The brightness in his eyes did not resolve into anything simpler. It stayed complex, relief and exposure, and something that had no clean name, the specific expression of a person who has handed over the most private thing they carry and is standing in the aftermath, waiting to discover what the handing over costs. She understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that this was the most courageous thing she had ever witnessed. Not the large public courage of battle, the kind that had banners and witnesses and the clean narrative of afterward. This smaller, more interior kind, the courage of a person who had been taught that vulnerability was a liability, who had been shaped by years and war and the weight of a name that didn't fit, choosing to place the truest version of himself in another person's hands with no certainty of what those hands would do. She thought about the crossed-out paragraph. She thought about his hands flat on the table after she'd told him, the tendons visible, the sustained tension held with the consistency of long habit. She thought about, I thought that meant something. She slid the parchment back across the table toward him, not returning it, not withdrawing, but a gesture of equal offering, her hands resting at its edge for a moment before releasing it. It suits you, she said quietly, more than the other one. His breath released. She heard it, barely, the fraction of a sound, but she heard it. It means light, he said. In the old form, my mother. He stopped, looked at the parchment. She told me once, when I was very young, that she had chosen a name that meant what she hoped I would be. I didn't understand it then. I thought she meant Draco. I thought the dragon was her hope. His voice was very level, maintained with precision, but underneath the precision was something she could hear clearly now. The particular frequency of a person speaking close to the center of a thing they rarely approached. It wasn't until much later that I understood the dragon was what my father hoped, what the family expected. She had given me something separate. Hermione looked at him across the table and felt something in her chest that was vast and specific at once, the way the sky was both. She was protecting it, she said, keeping it safe, until I was old enough to keep it myself. He looked up, or until someone else was. The restricted section quiet, the frost releasing at the windows, the name on the parchment between them. She held his gaze and did not look away, did not reach for the academic frame or the practical redirect or any of the managed distances she had previously maintained between herself and the full weight of what was happening in this room. She let it be its full weight. She let herself feel it. I'm going to keep it safe, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened in his face. The final release of the last maintained layer, the thing beneath the careful arrangement visible now in full, unhidden, the person who had carried a secret name for 22 years and was, for the first time, genuinely seen. I know, he said. And the simplicity of it, the absolute absence of qualification, was more than she knew what to do with. She looked down at her notes. She needed somewhere to put her eyes for a moment, somewhere to hold the magnitude of what had just been exchanged in this cold, pine-scented room, while her interior caught up with itself. Her notes were covered in the careful shorthand of 2 months of research, cross-references and margin notations, and the architectural handwriting mixed with her own in the places they had worked directly on the same page. Their handwriting, she noticed, had begun to look alike in some passages. Not identical. Hers was rounder, his more angular. But the rhythm was similar, the spacing, the way both of them left small marks in the margins for ideas they weren't ready to incorporate yet. She had not noticed this before. She noticed it now with a clarity that felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else at once. The paper, she said, because they were here, and it was Tuesday, and there was still work to do. And she had found that the ordinary container of the work was not a retreat, but a resting place, somewhere to put the large things while they settled. The paper, he agreed, and reached for his quill, and the motion was easy, unguarded, the gesture of someone who had set down a weight and found the resulting lightness strange, but not unwelcome. They worked for 2 hours. It was the best 2 hours of the entire project. She understood, moving through it, that this was what the research had been building toward. Not just academically, but in some other dimension she didn't have precise language for. The gift application section wrote itself, finally, the words coming with the ease of ideas that have been understood in the body before they are understood in the mind. She wrote about the Poznani tradition, about true knowledge as the necessary precondition of genuine recognition, about the difference between information and intimacy. She wrote clearly and specifically, and without the managed distances. And when she passed the page to him for his additions, he read it and looked up at her with the actual smile, not the almost movement, the real one, complete, brief, entirely transforming, and wrote 3 sentences that made her section better in ways she could see immediately. "That's the conclusion of the gift section," she said, reading his additions. "We still need the ethical framework to integrate it. I drafted that last night." She pulled the relevant pages from her folder. "I think it argues that the coercive and gift applications aren't simply opposed. They're the same mechanism operating under different moral conditions. The magic doesn't distinguish. The person using it distinguishes. Intent is the variable that changes the nature of the act entirely." He read her draft. She watched the small architectural notes his eyes made as they moved through it, the way his expression engaged with her argument. "It's good," he said. "There's one thing missing." "What?" "The acknowledgement that genuine knowledge, the kind required for the gift application, changes the person who holds it, not just the person who is known." He looked at her. "The research implies it, but the ethical section doesn't state it directly. If knowing someone's true name is the most complete form of recognition available, then the act of knowing, truly knowing, transforms the knower as well." She looked at her draft. She thought about the past 8 weeks, about the incremental, involuntary education of sitting across a table from someone who continually refused to be what she'd expected, who had placed his cold tea at his elbow and bent his head over old texts and spoken in careful architectural sentences. And occasionally, in the moments between the careful architecture, become briefly, completely visible. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known in September. She took the draft back and added a paragraph. He leaned forward slightly to read it as she wrote, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her shoulder, the small thermal fact of proximity, and she wrote with the steady hand of someone who knows exactly what they are saying and exactly why. To know another person's truest name is not a passive act. The knowledge reshapes the knower, reordering what they see and how they see it, adjusting the calibration of their perception in ways that cannot be undone. This is the gift tradition's deepest claim. Not merely that the named is seen, but that the act of seeing changes the one who sees. The oldest texts hold that this is the true protection built into the magic, that genuine knowledge of another cannot be held without accountability, without the weight of full recognition pressing back on the one who carries it. She set down her quill. He read the paragraph. She watched his eyes move through it once, twice, and then he sat back and looked at the middle distance for a moment with the expression of someone arriving at a conclusion they had been approaching from a long way off. "That's the paper," he said. "That's the paper," she agreed. The frost was entirely gone from the windows now. The morning had advanced into something properly bright, the autumn light coming through the library's high glass with an honesty that had nothing provisional about it, and the restricted section held them in it with the specific quality of a space that had witnessed something and was quietly, archivally noting the fact. She began gathering her notes, the careful assembly of 2 months' work, the pages aligning in her hands with the satisfying order of something completed. She was aware, as she did this, of him gathering his own materials at the other end of the table, unhurried, composed, but with a quality in his movements she hadn't seen before, a lightness that was not carelessness, but its opposite, the ease of someone who has set down a long-carried thing and is learning how to move without its weight. She picked up the compendium to return it to the shelf. Granger. She turned. He was standing at his side of the table, his bag over one shoulder, the parchment with his name on it held in his right hand. He looked at her with the open expression, the current fully visible, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The morning light between them and the pine and stone smell, and 2 months of approaching this exact point from opposite directions. "I want to ask you something," he said. She set the compendium on the edge of the table. "The paper will be submitted by Thursday," he said. "The partnership program ends. There's no assigned reason after that for us to be in a room together." He was holding his own gaze steady with visible effort, the effort she had learned to recognize as the sign of something that mattered. "I don't want that to be the end of it." She looked at him across the restricted section table. "What do you want it to be the end of?" she asked. "The assigned part." He paused. "I want the rest to continue." She felt the warmth move through her chest in its specific way, unhurried, entirely sure of itself. "The rest," she said. "Which is what, exactly? I'd like you to be precise." The corner of his mouth moved, then the actual smile, brief and real. "You," he said. "I want to continue you, spending time in rooms with you, thinking about things with you." A pause. "Looking at you." She had prepared in the 18 years of her life a great many responses to a great many situations. She had not prepared for this, for the specific quality of being wanted plainly, without the scaffolding of utility or assignment, by a person who had told her his truest name in a frost-light morning and was now standing at a library table, asking if the thing between them could outlast its original container. She crossed to his side of the table. He went still in the particular way of someone whose body has received information that their mind is still processing. She stopped close enough that the warmth between them was present and mutual, close enough to see the specific grey of his eyes in the bright morning light, and the slight colour that had moved into his face, and the way his breath had changed register. "I want the same things," she said. "All of them." She held his gaze. "And looking at you." He looked at her for a moment that had the quality of a breath held, full and present, and aware of its own fullness. Then his free hand came up, carefully, with the deliberate attention he gave to fragile things, and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face. His fingers brushed her cheekbone, warm and light, the silver ring a cool counterpoint against her skin. She reached up and placed her hand over his, holding it there against her face. His exhale, the way the remaining tension went out of his shoulders at the contact, the subtle structural release of someone who has been braced for a very long time against something that has finally and completely failed to happen. "Hermione," he said, her name in his voice, which she had been collecting since the amber Thursday afternoon, all the instances of it catalogued in the specific place below the sternum. But this was different from all the previous instances. Fuller, more direct, said with the particular weight of a person using a name they have finally, fully earned. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with the open expression, everything visible, Lucen and Draco, and all the complicated space between those two names present at once in his grey eyes. She rose onto her toes and kissed him. His response was immediate and unhurried at once, his hand moving from her cheek to the curve of her jaw, his other hand releasing the parchment to the table, both arms finding their way to her with the careful attentiveness he brought to everything that mattered. She felt the cold of the silver ring and the warmth of his hands and the specific texture of him, present and real. And she kissed him the way she had done everything in the past 2 months, with her full attention, without the managed distances. He kissed her back with the other kind of courage, not the public kind, the interior kind, the kind that cost more and lasted longer. When they separated, it was slowly, by degrees, the way two things that have been together find the moment of distinction again. She stayed close. His forehead came down to rest against hers, a small, deliberate gesture that was somehow more intimate than anything preceding it. The specific act of choosing to remain near when the formal reason for nearness had concluded. She could feel him breathing. "The paper," she said, into the small space between them. "Thursday," he said, "and after Thursday. After Thursday." His voice was low, the warmth in it something she felt rather than heard. "Everything you agreed to, all of it." She pulled back enough to look at him. His face in the honest morning light, without performance, without maintenance. The person her mother had whispered over in the first hour, the name she had spoken aloud and felt change the pressure of a room, looking back at her with the current no longer beneath anything, but simply, completely present. "We should return the compendium," she said. "We should," he agreed, and made no movement toward doing so. She laughed. It came out entirely involuntary, a small, genuine sound, and she watched it do something extraordinary to his expression. The actual smile again, but larger this time, less brief, moving into his eyes and staying there. "Hermione Granger is laughing in the restricted section," he said. "Hermione Granger has done considerably stranger things in the restricted section." "True." His hands were still at her waist, loose and warm. "Though I wasn't present for most of them. You were present for some. I was present for the wrong reasons. You're present for the right ones now." He looked at her with the open expression and the staying smile and said nothing, which was its own complete answer. She stepped back and picked up the compendium and returned it to its shelf, her hands steady, the pine and stone smell rising one last time as she slid it home. She came back to the table and gathered her notes and her bag and the research folder with 2 months of work in it. And he gathered his, and they moved toward the restricted section gate, together with the natural, unhurried coordination of 2 people who have been sharing space long enough that their movements have learned each other. At the gate, she paused and looked back at the table where the parchment still lay. His name, in his careful handwriting, left on the table's surface in the morning light. She looked at him. He reached back and picked it up, folded it once, with the same care he had carried it with for 22 years. Put it in his robe pocket, close to his chest. She watched him do this and thought about the letter in the family text, to whoever you one day trust enough to know it, and thought about the 1683 Carpathian winter and the woman who had gone to the source and brought the knowledge home, and about the first hour of a life and a name breathed over a child before the world had had any chance to say what that child should be. She thought about what it meant to be fully seen. They walked out of the restricted section into the morning library, into the warm, ordinary air of books and ambition, and the distant sound of the castle beginning its day. Madame Pince looked up from her desk with the specific expression she reserved for 8th years in the restricted section before breakfast, which was not quite suspicion and not quite approval, but occupied the precise midpoint between them. "Finished with the research materials?" she asked. "Yes," Hermione said. "Thank you." They walked out through the library doors into the corridor, and the morning was bright and cold and entirely itself, and the castle around them was stone and memory, and the long patience of a building that had held centuries of people finding and losing, and finding each other again within its walls. He walked beside her, close enough that their arms were in occasional, easy contact, the sleeve of his robe and the sleeve of hers, finding each other in the ordinary way of people who have stopped managing the distance. At the corridor's junction, where their paths toward morning classes diverged, they stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she said. And then, because she had spent 2 months learning the difference between what was said and what was meant, and because the morning was honest and the castle was patient, and she was done with the managed distances, Luton, his name, his true one, in her voice, which went lower by half a register when she meant something completely. She watched it move through him, the small structural shift, the redistribution of weight, the look in his grey eyes that was the furthest thing from the calculated coolness she had catalogued from years of corridors and classrooms, and the long, complicated history of 2 people who had circled each other through childhood and war, and the strange aftermath of both, arriving finally, improbably, here. He reached out and tucked her hair back again. The silver ring, the warm hand, the gesture already becoming familiar, already beginning to belong to the vocabulary of them. "Hermione," he said. She smiled. It was the full version, unreserved, and she didn't try to manage it. She turned and walked toward Charms with the honest autumn light coming through the corridor windows, and her notes under her arm, and his name in her mouth, kept there like the oldest kind of key. Behind her, she heard his footsteps on the stone. Precise, unhurried, no longer the sound of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. The sound of someone who had been found.
This story is about a name, not the name people call you, the name you really are. We all have two versions of ourselves, the one we show the world and the one we hide. Draco hid his for 22 years. He was afraid that if someone truly saw him, they would leave. Hermione was afraid too. She was strong and smart, but even strong people are scared of feeling too much. These two people were enemies. They were stranger than something else. Not because they were perfect, but because they were honest. Eventually, that is the hardest thing. Not falling for someone, being honest with them, showing them the real name, the hidden one. I wrote this story because I believe that every person deserves to be fully seen, not the version you perform, not the version they expect. If someone in your life make you feel safe enough to stay your real name, keep them. That is the rarest magic, and it has nothing to do with wands. Thank you for listening.